There are places in this world that carry something heavy, not the weight of stone or steel, but the weight of a life fully lived. A weight you can feel before you even step inside. Chuck Norris's property in Navasota, Texas is one of those places. For decades, people have driven past those gates and wondered, not about the man exactly because everyone knows the name. Everyone knows the myth, but about what lies beyond the walls. What does a man like that hold on to? What does he protect? And what, if anything, does he hide? When a small team was finally allowed access to his private garage and storage buildings during a ranch renovation, nobody walked in expecting much. Maybe some old vehicles gathering dust. Maybe a few film props stacked in a corner, maybe just silence. What they actually found changed the atmosphere of that room completely. It wasn't just the objects themselves. It wasn't just the surprising scale of everything stored there. It was what those things quietly said about the man behind the legend, and about the distance between the life everyone assumed he had lived and the life he had actually been living all along. There were artifacts connected to wars he never officially fought in, equipment tied to operations that have never been publicly explained. And then there were personal items, small and carefully kept, that pointed to a grief so private, so deeply carried, that nobody close to him had ever spoken about it out loud. And then in the far corner of the largest building, beneath a tarp thick with dust and years of silence, there was something else entirely. Something that stopped everyone in the room cold the moment they understood what they were looking at. This is not a story about gossip. It is not about scandal or exposure. It is about what happens when the myth finally meets the man, and what that quiet, honest gap reveals not just about him, but about all of us. Chuck Norris has been famous for so long that most people have genuinely forgotten he was ever just a person. Born in Ryan, Oklahoma in 1940, he came into the world without much waiting for him. His father was an alcoholic who left early, and his mother raised three boys mostly on her own, moving from town to town, scraping together whatever small life she could manage. Chuck was quiet as a child, introverted, reserved in a way that made him easy to overlook. He was not the kind of boy anyone stopped to notice and thought, there goes someone who will one day become a symbol. He found something close to purpose when he joined the military. Stationed in South Korea with the United States Air Force, he discovered martial arts and something in that discipline, something in the silence and the structure and the physical demand of it, clicked into place inside him in a way that nothing had before. He trained hard, he trained past the point where most people stopped. And when he returned home, he kept going because stopping was never really something that came naturally to him. By the late 1960s, he was competing in karate tournaments and winning them with a quiet consistency that drew attention without demanding it. The film work followed slowly, low budgets at first. Roles that suited his stillness, fights that looked real because they largely were, and then the 1980s arrived and something shifted. Chuck Norris stopped being an actor and became something larger. A symbol, a cultural shorthand for toughness, for self-reliance, for a kind of unspoken American resolve that people wanted desperately to believe in during a decade full of complicated truths. The jokes came later. The internet memes came much later still. But through all of it, decade after decade, the man himself stayed quietly private in a way that felt almost deliberate. He had married his high school sweetheart, Diane Holchek, back in 1958. They raised two children together and stayed married for 30 years before parting. In 1998, he married Gina O'Kelly, and in the rare interviews he gave over the years, he spoke carefully about what mattered to him: family, faith, land. The grounding weight of having something real and permanent beneath your feet. He bought the Lone Wolf Ranch in Navasota, Texas, and made it his home in the truest sense of that word. 5,000 acres of open sky and quiet distance, far from the cameras, far from the noise of a public life he had never seemed entirely comfortable with. For a man who had spent decades being turned into a symbol by other people, the ranch was his way of becoming a person again. And it was there on that land, inside those plain and functional buildings, that the real Chuck Norris had been quietly accumulating a life that almost nobody outside his innermost circle had ever been allowed to see. Until the day they opened the garage. The Lone Wolf Ranch does not announce itself. That is the first thing that quietly surprises people when they arrive for the first time. There are no grand iron gates with his name pressed into the metal, no imposing statues or monuments to his own legend. The land is working land, honest and undecorated, horses and cattle. Open pastures stretching further than comfortable sight. The buildings are built for function, not for impression, and they sit in the landscape like they belong there rather than like someone planted them to be admired. The garage complex sits toward the back of the main property, set behind a secondary fence line with no particular drama around it. There are three separate structures in total: a primary garage, a workshop, and a longer lower building that had been used for storage. Over the years, that storage building had grown quietly, section added to section, expanding without ceremony until it had become something substantial. The workers on the ranch knew not to enter it without a specific reason. Not because it was forbidden in any dramatic sense, but because it simply existed outside the rhythm of daily life on the property. When the renovation team arrived, they were met by one of Chuck's ranch managers. He walked them through the property with the ease of a man who knew every inch of it, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that the storage building hadn't been properly looked through in over a decade. That things had accumulated in there the way things accumulate in any life lived fast and fully, without the time or the inclination to stop and sort through it all. The primary garage alone told a story worth pausing over. There were vehicles that had clearly been with him for years, not all of them exotic or rare in the obvious sense. Some were simply old and weathered in the honest way of things that had been used, trucks from the 1970s that had seen real work. A motorcycle that people who knew him recognized from a photograph taken on the set of one of his earliest films. And in the corner, beneath a canvas cover that had faded over time from deep green to something closer to pale gray, sat a military-style Jeep with no plates and no visible origin markings. Everything was clean. Everything had been organized with a kind of quiet intentionality that told you something important. This was not the space of someone careless about what they kept. This was the space of someone who kept things for reasons, and who had never felt the need to explain those reasons to the world outside. It was only when the team moved into the storage building that the feeling in the room began, slowly and unmistakably, to change. The storage building was cooler than the air outside. Climate-controlled in a way that hadn't been obvious from the exterior, which meant the temperature had been regulated deliberately, consistently, over a long period of time. That detail landed quietly but firmly. This was not accidental. Nothing in there had been forgotten by mistake. Every object had been placed and every object had been protected. The first layer of things they cataloged were the film artifacts, and there were far more of them than anyone had anticipated walking in. Costumes and props from his film and television work going back to the early 1970s. Original wardrobe pieces from the missing in action films. Equipment from the production of Walker, Texas Ranger, not just small personal keepsakes but full sets of props that had apparently never been returned after filming ended. And then the scripts. Stacked and stored but clearly handled over years. Annotated in his own handwriting with the kind of margin notes that only someone who cared deeply about the work would leave. Questions circled, lines rewritten. Emotional beats marked with a simple word or two. What moved the people in that room was not the quantity of these things. It was the care. Every item was wrapped, every item was labeled, some of the labels were written in his own hand. Others, and this detail settled into the room quietly without anyone commenting on it at the time, appeared to be written by someone else entirely. That small observation would carry more weight later. Deeper inside, the nature of what surrounded them began to shift. The film pieces gave way to something different. Military items that were clearly not props, not costumes pulled from a wardrobe department, but real objects with real weight to them. Equipment and memorabilia that appeared to predate his own years of service by decades. Uniforms folded with precision into sealed containers. Photographs, some framed, some loose, of military units standing in places that were not immediately recognizable. Men in formation, landscapes without names, and medals, some bearing his name. Some bearing names that were not his. The team, which had been moving through the space with the casual efficiency of people doing a job they knew well, grew quieter. Their hands became more careful. Something in the room had shifted without anyone choosing it to. Nobody on the ranch had known this was all here, not even the people who had worked that land for years. It is worth being precise here, because precision in a story like this is its own form of respect. Chuck Norris served in the United States Air Force from 1958 to 1962. That service is documented and has been spoken about in interviews over the years without mystery or concealment. He was stationed at Asan Air Base in South Korea, where his path crossed with Tang Soo-do, and where the foundation of everything that followed in his life was quietly laid. His time in the military is not a hidden chapter. But what was stored in that building suggested a relationship with military life that did not simply end when his formal service did. There were photographs of him in settings that did not match any film production in his known catalog. Not tournament appearances, not promotional shoots. Images taken in what appeared to be operational environments, desert terrain, dense jungle. Groups of men around him who carried themselves in a way that was not the way actors or production staff carry themselves. The photographs had no dates, the backs of them carried no location names, and then there were documents. This is the point in the story where language must be chosen carefully, because the full content and official status of what was found has not been publicly confirmed. But according to the accounts of people who were present that day, the documents appeared operational in nature. They contained what were described as names, dates, and designations that did not align with any film or television project he had been part of. What those documents actually represent, whether they point to formal advisory roles, informal consultations, or something that exists in a quieter category without a clean public name. No official source has confirmed or denied. Questions have been raised, but no official conclusion has been reached. What is certain is that he had kept them, had stored them with the same deliberate care as everything else in that building, had placed them alongside the things that clearly mattered most to him personally. Chuck Norris had spent decades publicly supporting veterans and military families. He had trained soldiers. He had visited active bases. He had worked with organizations dedicated to POW and MIA families in ways that went far beyond the involvement of a celebrity lending his name to a cause. Some who knew him well had always quietly suggested that his interest in that particular chapter of American history ran deeper than any fictional role had required it to. The documents in that storage building did not explain everything. But the fact that they existed there at all, kept and preserved and held close, was itself a kind of answer to a question nobody had thought to ask directly. There is a moment in every story that resists being turned into a story. For the team inside that building, it came at the back of the storage space, behind a secondary partition that had not been visible from the entrance. Not a locked room, not a dramatic reveal. Just a deliberate separation, a smaller enclosed area set apart from everything else with a quiet intention that was immediately apparent when they stepped inside it. What was arranged in that space had been placed with a care that felt almost ceremonial, personal, sacred in the way that private grief, carried for years without witness, sometimes becomes. Children's belongings, carefully preserved and clearly tended to over time. A small jacket folded. A baseball glove worn soft and shapeless from actual use, from real hands gripping it on real days that could no longer be returned to. A series of drawings protected behind glass made in the unmistakable and heartbreaking hand of a very young child, and photographs. Not of Chuck Norris, the public figure or the cultural icon, but of a boy. Growing in early pictures, changing in the ones that followed, and then, toward the end of the sequence, visibly, quietly unwell. The public record of Chuck Norris's family is something most people know only in broad strokes. His son Mike Norris has lived his own life largely away from public attention. But within the family history there is a grief that has almost never been discussed openly. A child, a son from an early relationship before his marriage to Diane, who died young. The details sit quietly in biographical records, largely untouched, because the man himself never opened that door to the public and nobody who loved him chose to open it on his behalf. What was held in that small, separated space inside the storage building was not a secret exposed. It was something more private than that. It was evidence that across all the decades, through the films and the fame and the cultural mythology that had grown around his name, he had never stopped carrying this. Had never let these objects simply become the past. Had, in some way that words struggle to hold accurately, continued to keep that child close. Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment after understanding what they were looking at. Some things cannot be packaged into a reveal. Some things simply exist quietly and permanently beyond the reach of narrative. This was one of them. They almost didn't move it. The tarp in the far corner of the primary garage had been there long enough to collect a fine layer of dust along its upper edge, the kind of dust that accumulates slowly, patiently. Over years rather than months. The shape beneath it was larger than expected, roughly the size and outline of a full vehicle. And it had been secured at the base with a care that made the team instinctively cautious about disturbing it. When they asked the ranch manager about it directly, he paused for a moment before he responded. He said only that it had been there since before his time on the property. That he had understood it was not part of the renovation scope. And then, calmly, he stepped away to take a phone call. The decision to lift the tarp was made quietly, without any particular ceremony, after a brief exchange between the team lead and one of the senior workers. There was no dramatic countdown. Just the careful removal of something that had been left undisturbed for a very long time. Beneath it was a military-grade truck, full-sized. A model that was consistent, according to people present, with vehicles used by American forces during the Vietnam era. It was in a condition that surprised everyone in the room. Not pristine but maintained, cared for at some point though not recently. There were markings on the exterior that had been partially obscured, not stripped or erased, but covered in a way that read more like preservation than concealment. As though whoever had placed it there had wanted the original markings to remain intact beneath the surface, protected rather than removed. No registration was visible. No documentation was attached to the vehicle itself. Nothing that immediately offered an explanation of how it had arrived there or what its history was before the ranch. When the ranch manager was asked about it again, later in the day, his answer was measured and unhurried. He said that some things on the property carried histories he was not privy to. That Mr. Norris was a private man who had lived a long and full life, and that not everything required explaining to people who had only just arrived. There was no edge in his voice when he said it. No defensiveness. Just the calm and grounded certainty of someone who understood that real privacy, the kind that comes from a life lived with intention, is its own quiet form of dignity. Standing in that garage, surrounded by the accumulated weight of everything that had been kept there across the years, it was genuinely difficult not to feel the truth in that. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly, with answers, with everything labeled and explained and filed away in a way that satisfies the need for resolution. This is not that version. What the team found inside those buildings on the Lone Wolf Ranch was not a scandal waiting to be uncovered. It was not a secret position for exposure. It was something quieter than either of those things, and in its quietness, something considerably more affecting. It was the accumulated evidence of a life that had never fully matched its own public image, not because that image was dishonest, but because no public image, no matter how carefully constructed, can ever carry the full weight of a person. Chuck Norris built a myth. He did it through genuine skill and genuine discipline and a willingness to work harder and longer than nearly anyone around him. The cultural jokes, the memes, the iconic status that accrued to his name over time, none of that was manufactured. It grew around him because something in what he represented touched something real in the people who watched him. The man who came from nothing, the quiet fighter. The person who does not ask for help and does not make excuses for himself. But what was inside that garage pointed to a different kind of story running silently alongside the one the world knew. A story about grief held privately for decades without asking for acknowledgement. About a relationship with service and duty and loyalty that extended well beyond what any public record captured. About a man who kept them carefully and intentionally and close, because releasing them was never something he was prepared to do. There is something in that which is recognizable to almost anyone. The things we keep say more about who we truly are than the things we choose to display. The objects stored in the back corners of our most private spaces are the most honest self-portrait most of us will ever create. Not presented, not curated for an audience, just real. Chuck Norris is 85 years old as of this telling. He has navigated a serious health crisis in recent years that drew public attention and concern. He lives on his ranch with his wife Gina, and by most accounts he has moved further from public life. Not with bitterness, not with the sense of someone retreating in defeat, but with the natural gravity of a man drawing closer to what has always genuinely mattered to him. He has never spoken publicly about the contents of those buildings. He may never choose to, and there is something in that choice that deserves not just understanding, but genuine respect. The garage is closed again now. The tarp rests where it was. The small, separated space behind the partition holds exactly what it has always held. The military photographs are sealed back in their containers. The annotated scripts, the worn baseball glove, the child's drawings held carefully behind glass. All of it is exactly where it was before anyone arrived to look. Some things are not meant to be fully explained. Some lives are too complete, too layered, too honestly human to be reduced to a single clean summary. And perhaps the truest thing that can be said about what was discovered inside those buildings on a quiet Texas ranch is simply this. It reminded the people who saw it that behind every myth there is a man. Behind every symbol there is a history too full for any public image to contain. And behind every closed door there is always something more honest, more tender, and more real than the story being told outside of it. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think differently, even for a moment, about the people we turn into symbols and about the things we carry in silence without ever being asked, take a moment and share a thought in the comments. What do you think those objects really meant to him? And what does it say about all of us that we build legends around people, without ever stopping to ask what they hold on to when the cameras are gone and nobody is watching? If you want more stories told this way, told slowly and carefully, and with the kind of respect that real human lives deserve, subscribe and stay close. There are more worth telling.